Okay, so this is the homework for week 6. I'm showing the question from week 5 homework 1 as a reference, so this one you don't need to look at. Section 1 is right here, section 2, section 3, and section 4. And section 5, I actually have an example which I would show you also in the video, and then section 5 question is right here, so you can look at how this example is fixed and then approach this question. I also included the extra, so if you want to tackle this you can, but it's not required. Right. So this is something that we didn't cover in the class, but I think it would be a good exercise. And so I will show you how to approach solving this problem, and hopefully you can do it. So first, it says the efficient truss from week 5 homework 01, which is the previous week's homework, is shown here. This is something that we designed, that we using the graphic method. We determined that the top chord will have a constant force at 20 kPa in this case, and so we fixed this dimension, and so that the top chord is in constant force 20 kPa, and we found this form, which incidentally the bottom chord takes the shape of funicular curve. So therefore it's supposed to be the most efficient shape, and these internal diagonal members ended up having 0 forces. So for a explanation for what the funicular form is, I posted a link here, actually 2 links. One is a video that talks about the funicular form, and the other is the article that explains it. So I recommend referring to these links. So now what I would like you to do is, so here is another truss with a bottom chord taking a very similar shape, but it's ever so slightly different. So I'm showing the original truss bottom chord from above in gray here, so it's slightly deeper, but it's almost the same. So then I would like you to analyze this truss and observe what happens to the forces in the top chords as well as these diagonal chords. So now, in order to do the analysis, same thing as always, A, B, C, D, E, F, G around the truss, and then all the internal panels are numbered. And I've already mapped the vertical forces here. A, B is here, B, C, C, D, D, E, E, F, and I've also mapped the reactions, F, G, and G, A, right? So I would like to start the analysis from this point. Right, so now we're gonna look at 1G first, going clockwise. So this is 1G, so it has to start from, it has to pass through point G, and point 1 would be somewhere on this line. So that's done, and this one is GA because it's between G and A, and that's already mapped. And then I would go to this horizontal member, which is the Q1. So this is between A and 1, so I'm going to call that A1, which should be a horizontal line that passes through A and also passes through 1. So 1 is also on this horizontal line. Therefore, we know the 1 is right here. Pretty straightforward. So now we're gonna move to the next node over here. Let's start from 1, 2, which is this vertical line, which passes through 1. And 2 should be on this vertical line somewhere. So that was about this member, which is 1, 2. Next we go to this one, which is 2G, right? So I'm going to anchor it to point G because it's supposed to pass through point G. And so therefore, again, the 2 is on both this diagonal line and that vertical line. So therefore, we have to conclude that point 2 is at the intersection. So therefore, it's got to be here. Next member is G1, which is already analyzed, so we're gonna move on to the next node. So now, let's see, 1A is already located, this one's already located, it's 1AB, and this one's B3, so this tells us it has to pass through point B. And point 3 has to be on this horizontal line somewhere. What you probably notice is that because the shape of these two trusses are very similar, our force diagram will end up looking very similar as well. So you might have guessed, from the previous example, point 2 and 3 happen to be at the identical point. Therefore, this diagonal member was zero force member. But now, because the geometry of the truss has changed ever so slightly, what you would notice is that even though it's very close, if you zoom in, the force diagram from the previous truss on the left side, it shows 2 and 3 as the identical point, but now you can kind of observe the point 2 has shifted above slightly, so that's something different. So then we're gonna continue our analysis. So we were looking at this member, which is right here between 3 and 2. 2, 1 we already analyzed, so we're gonna skip this, and so therefore we're gonna move on to the next member. Alright, so now staying here, so this diagonal one, which is G2, which is already analyzed. This one is 2, 3, so this is a new one. So 2, 3, according to this, is supposed to be a diagonal line that starts or passes through 2 and also passes through 3. So what we can tell is that 3 must be on this diagonal line as well as on this horizontal line, which is really at this intersection if you zoom in. So that should be our point 3. So that's what we are gonna do. sure it intersects. So that's our new point 3. So that's the difference from the first truss, where 2 and 3 were identical points, but now they are slightly off from each other. So that means the diagonal member in the new truss, which is right here, it's going to have a very small force because the length of this line is very short compared to the others, but it's definitely not 0. So that's the important difference, and the reason why that the forces in these diagonal members are not 0 now is because this bottom curve is not a funicular form, so it's not the most efficient form in terms of taking the tension. So that's the difference. So I would like you to continue constructing this diagram, and then you should be able to read that diagram to get these answers. Just to give you a clue, your diagram should end up looking like this. So point 2 and 3 slightly off, point 4 and 5 slightly off, 6 and 7 slightly off, 8 and 9 slightly off. So that's actually kind of a interesting comparison with the previous diagram. So you can see how point 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, those have slightly shifted. So the next one is this section 2. This is the first problem that we went over in the class, in which I have to make actually one correction. So the question is basically what happens now if we move the lows. So the first question, the question from last week was this top-loaded truss with constant force in the top chord. So now what happens if we change these lows from these top nodes at the top chord to the bottom chord. So now it's a bottom loaded truss. So one mistake I made here is, I think before the class, in order to save time, I just swapped A, B, C, D, E, F at the top and the G at the bottom, but here's, I think, was the source of the problem. So when we name these zones outside the truss, it should follow this clockwise order. So because I flipped these two, now instead of being A, B, C, D, E, F, it's actually going from F, E, D, C, B, A, and G. And that caused the mismatch between the force diagram and the form diagram here, because the force diagram shows the first load as being AB, second one being BC, next one being CD, and for example the reaction being FG. So if you compare that to what's shown on the truss, for example, the first load here on the right side is, this should be called FE, next one's ED, DC, CB, BA, and the first reaction on the right side it's GF, so there's a complete mismatch between what's shown on the truss and what's shown on the force diagram. So we need to correct that. So now if we follow the original rule of naming these areas following the clockwise order, it should be named as shown on the left side. So now it's the first applied load is between A and B, next load is B and C, next one C and D, so on and so forth, and the top outside of the top chord is G. That actually matches what's shown on the force diagram, being the first applied load from the right side, that's AB, next one is BC, next one being CD, next one being DE, and the next one's EF. So that's the last one that's between E and F, so that's called EF, following the clockwise order. Then the reaction on this side is FG, which is this upward force, and then the last one is going around and showing this GA, which is that last force. So now there is no conflict between the force diagram and the form diagram, so we can move forward. So we've already covered in the class, so it's probably obvious that the form, the resulting form of this efficient truss would be the same as the first problem from the 5th week, the top-loaded version of this, but I will just go over just in case. So the same assumption that we have a constant force of 20k pounds at the top chord, all of these top chords. So G1, G3, G5, G6, G8, G10, all of that being 20k pound force, or 20,000 pound force. So that's where I am going to draw this horizontal line at 200 inches long. And so that's parallel to all of the top chords, so that's basically G1, G3, G5, G6, G8, and G10. So we can conclude that the point right there is all of those points, so that's basically 1, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 10. So as usual, we can start the analysis from the corner point, which is right here. So following the clockwise order, we're going to be looking at each member. So this diagonal member, which is 1F, is right here. So it's supposed to be this diagonal angle. We don't necessarily know the exact angle, but now that we have identified the point 1, which is right here, so we can connect 1 on F, and that's going to determine the angle of this chord, which is, again, it's going to be slightly deeper. Like this. So, and the next one, which is this vertical reaction, is FG, so that's already mapped here. G1 is already mapped here. So we are done with analyzing this node. So moving on to the next point. Zooming in slightly further. So this diagonal chord we have just identified, which is F1, which is right here. So that's good. 1, 2 is supposed to be this vertical line, on which point 2 lies somewhere, but we don't know exactly where, so we will map it as 2 question mark. Next diagonal one, which is 2E, so it should pass through point E, and on this diagonal line somewhere there's also a point 2. So technically we are not able to identify the angle of this diagonal line yet, but the fact that the point 2 is on this diagonal line as well as on this vertical line kind of forces us to conclude that it should be on the intersection between the point 2 should be on the intersection between this diagonal line and that vertical line. But since we haven't identified the angle of this diagonal line, we can't really locate the point 2 yet. EF is already mapped, so we have to move on to the next point, which is here. So again, 2, 1 shows that vertical line. 1G is already mapped, G3 is already mapped, and so the 3, 2 would be this diagonal line that is going to pass through point 3, but also passes through point 2. So now between so now from these two pieces of information, first one being there's a vertical line passing through point 1 on which the point 2 sits, but also there's a unknown diagonal line between point 2 and point 3, but point 3 is already locked in there. So between these two pieces of information, we need to we are forced to conclude that actually point 2 is also identical to point 1 and point 3. So that locks down point 2 onto that location, which also is going to fix the angle of that line E2, which corresponds to that bottom chord. So we can eliminate all of these temporary lines, and now we are kind of we know what the angle of that bottom chord is. I guess I will continue this up until the halfway point. Let's move on to the next point here. So now we have identified E2 already, so that's kind of done. Let me freeze this. And 2, 3 is also a that's a zero force member, and we've identified where the point 2 is on the force diagram. 3, 4 is this vertical line, and point 4 should live somewhere on this vertical line. Moving on to the next one, which is this diagonal line 4D. So it would be some kind of diagonal line, and point 4 would be somewhere on this diagonal line, but the fact that it's also on that vertical line forces us to conclude that it's gotta be on the intersection between this diagonal line and the vertical line. However, technically we don't know yet the angle of this diagonal line, so we can't really locate the point 4 yet. But you probably guessed it, that the point 4 will probably end up being an identical point as all of the other points, which is right here. But we can't conclude that yet, so we're gonna move on to the next node. Again, this vertical member is 4, 3. We have 3G, which is already mapped, G5, which is already mapped here. So now we have this new vertical line, diagonal line 4, 5, and point 5 is right here. And the angle of this diagonal line we don't necessarily know, but so that kind of tells us point 4 should be on this diagonal line, which passes through 5. So again, so even though we don't know the angle of this diagonal line between these two pieces of information, we can conclude that point 4 is on the intersection between these two lines. The fact that this diagonal line 4, 5 passes through point 5 tells us that no matter what the angle of this diagonal line is, the intersection between this diagonal line and the vertical line is identical point as point 5. So then this again forces us to conclude that point 4 is in fact same point as point 5. So also that help us to determine the angle of line 4D or D4, which is right here. So that's basically, that determines again the angle of that bottom chord, that part of the bottom chord, which is 4D. So by now, if you keep going with this process, it's probably pretty obvious that because everything is symmetrical on the truss, your force diagram will end up looking completely symmetrical, and you can probably guess that all of the points actually 1, 2, 3, 4, all of the number points are actually going to be identical at this point. So your resulting truss should look more or less like this. So your resulting truss should look like this, and you should be able to determine the internal forces in each of these members. So the top cores, obviously we set it to be constant, so 1G, 3G, 5G, 6G, 8G, 10G, which is, you should be able to derive it from the length of this horizontal line. The bottom chord, we pretty much already know because it's the length of either of these lines. Then I think you should also determine what the member 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, what those would be, but it's probably pretty self-explanatory. So if you read the question, so we have a truss that's shown here, which I will zoom in a second, but we want to keep the bottom cores G1, G3 through G10 to have a constant force of 25,000 pounds, which is slightly different from the last one, which was 20,000, so you should be careful about that. Now if you zoom in, I think so again, what I need to correct from what I've shown you in class was I had these areas named as shown here because I was trying to skip some time and yeah, skipped some steps. So instead of going from A, B, C, D, E, F from the left, what we need to be careful about is all the naming convention follows the clockwise order around the truss. So it should actually go from the right to left, around, and then above, and then come back down, right? So this is the clockwise naming system. So instead of being like this, we should have named the one that's on the right A. So this first force is AB, B, C, C, D, D, E, E, F, going around the corner, going up, F, G, then coming back around down, G, A, right? So that's G, A. So now that's basically if we map the force from right, actually bottom, following clockwise order around, then the first applied force that's here, that's AB, next one's BC, next one is CD, next one is DE. So this is a bottom loaded truss with this diagonal chord on the top. So in the question, I'm asking the bottom horizontal chord, to have a constant force of 25,000 pounds. So that would be equivalent to 250-inch line in this force diagram, applying the force scale that we are using. So basically we have A10, B8, C6, D5, E3, F1, all of those as a horizontal line whose length is 250. So going from the right side, it's the first one is A10, next one is B8, next one is C6 because it's between C and 6, and next one is D5, E3, the last one being F1. So we have mapped all of these numbers here. So again, we're going to start by analyzing each node, and what we know is our truss will want to look like this in general, but we don't really know the exact geometry of it, and angle and those things. So we'll start from this first corner. This vertical force is Fg, which is already mapped here as a reaction, upward force. Next one, which is this unknown diagonal line, which is going to be called G1. So we already have point G and point 1 fixed from the previous round. So that is going to be the angle of that top diagonal chord between G and 1. So this can be deleted. So that was G1, and the horizontal one is called 1F, which is already mapped here. So we are done with this node, so we can move on to the next node. And again, we have this, which is EF, which is mapped here, F1, which is mapped as a horizontal line here. 1, 2 is a vertical line that we don't know the length of, but we can determine that the point 2 is supposed to be on this vertical line somewhere, but we don't know exactly where, so I'm going to leave it as a question mark. So that's an information from that vertical line. And the next one is this guy, which is 2, 3, which is supposed to be some sort of diagonal line, but we know it's going to pass through point 3, and it passes through point 2. So again, the fact that point 2 is both on this diagonal line and this vertical line forces us to conclude that it's at the intersection, which is identical to point 3. So point 3 is actually point 2 as well as point 3. And moving on, 3E is this horizontal line, so we can move on to the next line, next node. And so here we have 2, 1, which we already mapped. Actually, it's a 2, 1 is this vertical line, so there's got to be some force in that vertical member. 1G, which we already mapped. And next one, which is this diagonal line, would be called G2. So it would be a line that connects point G and point 2. Right, so now that actually helps us determine the angle of that top diagonal chord. It should be parallel to this force, so that's basically the top chord, so we can delete these guys. So that actually locks in this vertical member as well as that diagonal member. Now moving on to this next node, the vertical force is dE, which is mapped. E3, which is a horizontal force, which is here. 3, 4 is supposed to be a vertical force, and 4 is somewhere on there, so I'm just gonna temporarily put it here, label it with question mark. So 3, 4 is done. 4, 5 is again this unknown diagonal force that passes through point 5, and point 4 is somewhere on here, which is again the same process. Point 4 must be the intersection of these two lines, therefore it's gotta be identical to point 5. 5D is already mapped, so we're going to move on to the next node. So 4, 3 is this vertical line, so there's got to be some force in that member. 3, 2 is already mapped, 2G is already mapped, and then we come back to G4, which must be a line that connects G and 4, which helps us determine the angle of that top chord. And therefore, all of these would be fixed. Right, and then again 4, 3 is this vertical line, so we're done analyzing this point. Looking at the bottom node, 6C is the horizontal line here, D5 is a horizontal line here, 5, 6 is supposed to be this vertical force. Let me just copy this dashed line. Actually 6 is already located here, so 5, 6 is actually this vertical force, so there's got to be some force in here. So that's done for this point. We're gonna go up. Again, 6, 5 is a vertical force, 5, 4 is zero force, because 4 and 5 is identical. 4G, we already located them. This downward diagonal line, which is going to be called G7, would be a line that connects G and 7, which is yet to be identified. And we also have this diagonal line from 6, on which point 7 lives somewhere. So I think I'll stop the explanation here, but if you keep going, I think everything would be pretty straightforward, but it will end up looking like this, and your truss also should be symmetrical. Right, so from this force diagram you should be able to analyze the internal forces of each member, and as well as after you draw this truss, you should be able to tell what the depths of this truss is. Alright, so this is section 5. So for this I'm showing the example on the left side, which I would explain all the process to get to the answers, and on the right side I'm showing the actual question, which is slightly different, but you should be able to follow the same exact process. The difference being, on the left side I'm asking the bottom chord to have a constant force of 25,000 pounds, which I will show you. On the right side it's saying that it's the bottom chord force would be 18,000 pounds. So yeah, so this form is actually the form that's derived from the question on the left. So if you correctly draw this with this requirement, the geometry is going to be slightly different. It's going to be different, and the dimension is going to be different too, but then I want you to basically get the depths of the resulting truss and all of these internal forces. All right, so now again we are starting with this truss that we used for the homework on week 5. So this truss is again assumed to have a constant force in the top chord for 20,000 pounds. So this is the geometry that we arrived at. So now what we want to do is to start tweaking the force diagram depending on the new requirement, and then modify the form of the truss. So as we discussed, the new requirement is that we want to have a constant force in the bottom chord that is 25,000 pounds. Since we're using this force scale, so basically what's going to happen is the geometry of this truss will be slightly different, and the force diagram here, all of these diagonal lines which represents the bottom chord of this truss, it would have the length of 250 inches, which represents 25,000 pounds. So the first thing that we do is that we are going to draw a circle whose radius is 250. Just to confirm this, you can get the property, and it says the radius is 250 inches. So the point 1, so the internal force in this original truss at G1 and G10 happens to be at 250, but anyway, so that one doesn't change. Another assumption is that the top chord is staying as horizontal, so we are not going to change that. So basically the forces in each of these members should not change directions. So A1, B3, C5, D6, E8, F10, all of these lines need to remain as a horizontal line. So basically, so then the thing is, we don't necessarily know, so the forces in these horizontal members might change, so I'm just going to extend it so that it's the length is undefined, because it's most likely going to change. So again, we can start sort of analyzing point by point from the left side. So we're going to look at that. So that one, 1G, it happens to be, if you get the length of that, it's 250 inches, so the force is correct, so that can stay as is. This is okay, and A1 is staying as horizontal, so that's pretty much point 1 is staying where it is, and 1G, the angle is still as is. So this is correct, and we're gonna move on to this next point. So first of all, so there are a couple of unknowns here, so we don't know. What we don't know is these might change, because but this one is fixed, right? So we'll look at this first. So G1 is already fixed, and 1, 2 we don't know. 2G, it also may change its geometry, right? So how it's going to change is that this G2, the bottom chord, the force needs to be 25,000 pounds. So the length in this force diagram needs to be 250. So current length is 219, so that's problematic. Another thing that we know is that B3 is also staying as a horizontal line. So that point 2 and 3 needs to move to a first of all, it may move along this only direction it may move is along this horizontal line. Where it needs to be is that it needs to be at the length of 250 inches. The only place that's possible is the intersection between this circle, which is the radius is 250, and this horizontal line. So this point needs to move to here, right? And another thing that happens is this, what used to be this vertical line that connects point 1 and point 2 now moves to this angle. So now what we know is that actually this first one, which used to be vertical, now is going to change to this. So it gets trimmed off here, and the second diagonal line needs to be parallel to G3. So this is how it's going to be changing, but it's probably kind of confusing to be manipulating the form and the force diagram first. So let's just focus on the force diagram, following the same logic, and then modify the form of the truss. So following the same logic, all of these diagonal lines in cyan needs to be at the length of 250 inches, but we can't simply extend it to this circle because it's going to change the angle as well. Therefore, these horizontal lines would be helpful, because we know that the top chord is staying as horizontal lines as well. So all we're gonna do is you can do intersect two sets. This is convenient command when you want to, for example, I want to intersect this circle and this set of lines. So I get these 3 intersection points, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the edit points on for all of these guys, and now 0.45 needs to move to this intersection. 0.67 needs to move to that intersection. 0.89 needs to move to that intersection. Therefore, the resulting diagram would look like this. And let's modify the truss geometry from here. So first of all, 1, 2 is going to be here. The next one, 3, 4 is here. 5, 6 replaces that. 7, 8 replaces this, and then 9, 10 replaces this. So just to make it easier to deal with, I'm gonna scale these lines, and now the bottom chord, the angles of bottom chords are as shown on these. So trim this, and next one, which is 2G, is right here. G is here. 7G is here. 9G is right here, and 10G is right here. So in the problem, I included this link that shows the image of an example of a bridge like this. So again, so this is the bridge in France. So in this case, you can see how the bottom chord is at constant size, because again, taking this form, the bottom chord is sort of guaranteed to be at constant internal force, so therefore they can use the same size member throughout. So going back to the analysis, so now that we have completed this diagram, we should be able to determine the internal forces of each of these members. So now, because we required the internal force of the bottom member to be constant, that should be at the constant force, right? So for example, let's take the first one, which is 1G, which is right here. So let's analyze about this point, right? So this member, the bottom chord, is called 1G, following the clockwise notation. So 1G would be a line that starts from 1 to and ends at G. So the arrowhead should be on the G side. So given that direction of the force, that member at that left point is pulling this member. So this member must be in tension. Let's just kind of verify that from the other point. So analyzing about this point, if you go clockwise, this member is called G1. So G1 would be going from G to 1. Right, again, so that arrow on that end indicates that that member right here is in tension, because the point is being pulled to the middle of the member. So this guy is in tension, and again, because the length of that line is 250, the tension should be at 25 kPa. So I mean, we kind of already know the bottom chord is always in tension, so everything is at the same length, so we can say that the entire bottom chord is actually always in tension for 25,000. So now the top chords, in the previous truss we assumed that the top chord to be in constant internal force, but now it should be different because the length varies, right? So now if let's go back to the first point again and analyze this member, which is from this point it's called A1. So if you connect point A, starting from point A, ending at point 1, the force should be facing this direction, and if you bring that to that point, it indicates that the member right here is pushing towards that point, so that indicates this member is in compression, and it's 200 inches, so it's got to be a 20,000 pound force. So I would write that it's in compression, 20 kPa. So following the same, we also kind of know, I mean, you can analyze about all the points, but it's quite obvious that all these top chords are in compression, so you can get the lengths here: 23.3, 24.8, and also you can get the lengths of these, not vertical anymore, but these vertical-ish diagonal members. You can get those lengths. These are in compression. Let me just point out, oops, let me just demonstrate how all of these are compression as well, by going to one of the points. So if you went to this point, that member is called 3-4. 3-4 would be a force that starts from point 3 and ends at point 4, so it should be facing that direction, and if you move it to here, it's pushing towards that point, so that member is also in compression. So if you completed this exercise, you should get a reading something like this. So all of these are compression, all of these are compression, and the bottom chord is in tension. And these magnitude of forces you can get by measuring the lengths. So therefore that's 68591, so I wrote 6.9 pound. This is close to 6.2, and this is at 6, so on and so forth.